information about special flood hazard area. Now, at the very top of each page is concerning the property at. If you have the address, you're going to put the address. If you don't have the address, you'll put TBD. At the very top, you'll put the address of the property if you have address or property already selected. But however, if you're where you're just doing your buyer's consultation, you haven't selected a property yet, you just put TBD or to be determined. Okay. All right, let's get into it. So concerning the property at the address or to be determined. A, flood area. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, designates areas that have high risk of flooding as special flood hazard areas. A property that is in a special flood hazard area is designated on flood insurance rate maps, with zones being in V or A. Both V zone and A zone area indicates a high risk of flooding. Some properties may also lie in the floodway, which is the channel of river or other water course and adjacent land areas that may be reserved in order to discharge of flood waters under FEMA rules. Communities must regulate developments in those floodway areas. So before they build community stuff, usually they have to test where the water is. Very important. But let's keep reading. So availability of flood insurance. Generally, flood insurance is available regardless of whether the property is located in or out of the special flood zone hazard areas. Contact your insurance agent to determine if any limitations or restrictions apply to the property in which you're interested. FEMA encourages every property owner to purchase flood insurance regardless of whether the property is in a high, moderate, or low risk flood area. We live in Texas, so I highly recommend everyone at least get a quote. We'll talk about that a little more. Homeowners may obtain flood insurance coverage up to certain limits through the National Flood Insurance Program. Supplemental coverage is available through private insurance carriers. Now, a mortgage lender making a federal related mortgage will require the borrower to maintain flood insurance if the property is in a special flood hazard area. Let's talk about ground requirements. So pretty much if you get a loan and it's in a flood hazard area, you're more than likely going to have flood insurance. Ground flood requirements. Many homes in special flood areas are built up or elevated. In elevated homes, the ground floor typically lies below the base flood level, and the first floor is elevated on piers, columns, posts, or piers. The base floor elevation is the highest level in which a flood is likely to occur, as shown on the flood insurance rate map. Federal, state, county, and city regulations restrict the use of construction of ground flood enclosures in elevated homes that are in special flood hazard areas. I don't know if you ever went to, there's several places in Houston that are in flood zone area where they build it up, but when they build it up, it looks like one of those homes in Galveston where, there's like nothing under it, but it's built up, and then the first floor is like, looks like maybe a story and a half already built out. So they do have building regulations for homes in those areas if they do even allow you to build. But they may prohibit or restrict remodeling, rebuilding, and redeveloping of properties and improvements in the floodway. And you guys understand floodways have changed over the time because we've built so many new communities. The flood hazard areas have changed, so this can definitely affect that. The first floor of all homes must now be built above the base flood level. Older homes may have been built in compliance with applicable regulations at the time of construction and may have had the first floor that lie below the base flood level, but flood insurance rates for some homes may be significant. It is possible that modifications were made to ground floor endorsed after a home was built. The modifications may or may not comply with applicable regulations and may or may not affect flood insurance rate. It is important for a buyer to determine if the first floor of a home is elevated or at or above the base flood elevation. It is also important for a buyer to determine if the property lies in a floodway. Ground floor enclosures that lie below the base flood level may be used only for parking, storage, building access, plumbing, mechanics, electrical items in ground floor enclosures that lie below the flood elevation may be prohibited or restricted and may not be eligible for flood insurance coverage. Additionally, in A zone, the ground floor enclosure below the base flood elevation must have flown through vents or openings that permit the automatic entry and exit of flood water. In V zone, the ground floor enclosure must have breakaway walls, screens, lattice walls. Those like they look like little grades. I don't know how to explain it. In the floodway, in floodway, the remodeling, reconstruction, and improvement may be prohibited or otherwise restricted. Compliance: the above reference property may or may not comply with regulations affecting ground flood enclosure below the base floodline elevation. A property owner is eligible to purchase or maintain flood insurance, as well as the cost of the flood insurance is dependent on whether the property complies with the regulations affecting ground floor enclosures. A property a purchase or property owner may be required to remove or modify a ground floor enclosure that is not in compliance with the city or county building requirements or is not entitled to exemption from requirements. A flood insurance policy maintained by the current property owner does not mean that the property is in compliance with the regulations affecting ground floor enclosures, or that the buyer will be able to continue to maintain flood insurance at the same rate. Insurance carriers calculate the cost of flood insurance using a rate that is based on the elevation of the lowest floor. So if the ground floor lies below the base floor level and does not meet federal, state, county, and city requirements, the ground floor will be the lowest floor for the purpose of computing the rate. If the property is in compliance, the first elevation floor will be the lowest floor, and the insurance rate will be significantly less than the rate for a property that is not in compliance. If the property lies in V zone, the flood insurance rate will be impacted if a ground floor enclosure based on the flood elevation exceeds 299 square feet, even if it's constructed with breakaway walls. And E, let's talk about elevation certificate. The elevation certificate is an important tool in determining the flood insurance rate. It is used to provide elevation information that is necessary to ensure compliance with flood map plain management laws. To determine the property insurance premium rate, the insurer relies on the elevation certificate to certify building elevation at an acceptable level above flood mat level. It's available in your area. It's recommended that you obtain an elevation certificate for the property as soon as possible to accurately determine future flood insurance rate. You are encouraged to inspect the property for all purposes, including compliance with ground flood insurance, flood enclosure requirements. Review the flood insurance policy, cost, and coverage with your insurance agent, and contact the building permit authorization if you have any questions about building requirements or compliance issues. Ladies and gentlemen, it is very important that you do this or have your clients get their quotes during the option period, okay? That way, if they find out that this property is going to be a little, maybe it's no longer in compliance, because once it's no longer in compliance, whoever owns it now has to get the house up to code, and that could be very expensive. Another thing too, flood insurance. If you do get flood insurance, even if you're not in a flood zone and you get insurance, it is effective immediately at closing, which is really awesome. You cannot do that thing where you think, if you watch the news and you see hurricane coming, you can't call your insurance provider and they'll hey, let's get insurance. They'll take your money, but it won't be effective immediately. Sometimes it's effective 30, even 60 days after you've started coverage. So definitely, especially if you're not in a flood area, generally it's quite inexpensive to have. So it's better safe than sorry. We do live in Texas, so having that coverage is better to have than not. Um, but what you're doing here is just kind of letting them know this is where the buyers sign right there. So you'll assign it to one of your buyers, if you can, all right? And that's where they sign. So the main thing about this is information purposes for them to know about the flood hazard areas. Another place you can go and actually see if you're in a flood hazard area, go to MLS. Sorry, you only have a little view. I'm just gonna pull up a listing real quick. And what you're gonna do is click it. Make sure you can see this whole thing. You're gonna click on the flood map. In MLS, you have that nice, and see there, right there, little cheat sheet for you. You can see where you are. You can look at here. You can look here, or you can look at the little this down here at the bottom, which kind of tells you where you are. That's the property right here. It's in X. See, it's outside of the special flood hazard area. If you're not sure of where the house lies, contact your insurance provider, get the address, and get them on the phone and get the information. But if you have access to MLS, most of the time you just click on this little flood map area. If you can't tell by the colors, you can look up here and it'll tell you the zone X and the zone description, and saying it's outside zone X, an area that is determined to be outside of the 100 and 500 year flood zone plain. But if you're even this, to me, the AE is what? AE is a 100-year flood zone. I'm not saying it might happen, but if you're that close to this, you're that close to it, so it's not required. So more than likely, it's going to be pretty inexpensive for you to have flood insurance. I would go ahead and recommend that they go ahead and get a quote and get flood insurance if need be, because they're much more closer to this than over here across the street. Does that make sense? All right, but that's all for that. If you have any questions, let me know.